Hi guys. So on Wednesday, Rishi Sunak and his Home Secretary lost their appeal over the Rwanda policy. The Supreme Court ruled that it was unlawful to send people to the country as they deemed it unsafe on a number of grounds. So what was the reaction from the government? Well, it was to accept the ruling and quietly mothball the idiotic policy and move on to something else. Only joking. Rishi Sunak is planning to introduce emergency legislation to work around the problem, basically deeming Rwanda safe. Nuts. Here was ex-cabinet minister Simon Clarke reinforcing the madness.
Anyone's standards are an unsustainable level of illegal immigration. And for my part, I think that the gauntlet is now being thrown down. And I think we are going to have to pass emergency legislation at a minimum to set out that the will of Parliament will apply, notwithstanding the ECHR and the associated conventions that the justices referenced. But we may also need to consider, if that is not legally viable, withdrawal from the ECHR. Because let us be clear, replacing it with the British Bill of Rights does not mean that human rights don't apply in Britain anymore. What it does mean is that a convention which has clearly been extended in its interpretation far beyond what anyone in 1951 could remotely have considered plausible, let alone likely, needs to be constrained.
It needs to be constrained in order for us to reach out to racists and bigots and keep them happy for about 5 minutes. Because that's what it's about. So, exiting the European Convention on Human Rights. You actually don't exit the convention, you just don't apply the convention. We're talking about the Council of Europe. But let's say for the sake of argument, the UK government decides we're going to leave the Convention on Human Rights and instead have a Bill of Rights. Okay, but as we've seen before, if British citizens can't get access to justice in Britain, where can they go? They can go to the European Court of Human Rights. But if you leave the convention, they won't be able to do that. If you leave the Council of Europe, they won't be able to do that. Be like Belarus and Russia. So there's a massive problem here. Because if the Tories do actually achieve this, I don't think this is going to happen. But I've said before, there's a very, very slim chance that it will happen. But if it does happen, it will have serious consequences for the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And then that will have serious consequences for the UK government, because the Americans would not be very happy about that. Or the European Union, they won't be happy about it either. So that's that's the European Convention on Human Rights. The other point that he raised here is emergency legislation, in a sense, to deem Rwanda safe. But that doesn't make any sense, because if the Supreme Court has deemed Rwanda unsafe, then how is changing legislation, bringing in legislation saying actually Rwanda is safe, going to change that? You're not going to be able to change the opinion of the justices with legislation. Like, this made no sense whatsoever. I've talked about this in another clip, in another video. Did anyone actually think about this policy before implementing it? Is Rwanda a safe country? What we're talking about here is we're going to send people to Rwanda, not to be processed, but we're going to just directly send them to Rwanda so they can claim asylum there. If they're successful, they stay in Rwanda. If they're not, they're sent off to somewhere else. But they become Rwanda's problem, not our problem. There was a bit of misunderstanding over this. There was this idea that the Home Office was going to pick people up as they arrive on British soil and transport them to Rwanda, where they would have their claim processed. No, that's not what's happening. That was not the plan. It was to send people there with a one-way ticket, not to return. But the whole idea that Rwanda was safe made no sense, because the Home Office was granting asylum to people from Rwanda. So the Home Office had deemed Rwanda unsafe because it was granting people asylum. It was trying to suggest to the public that Rwanda was safe. The Supreme Court said it's not safe, and now Rishi Sunak and his administration want to introduce legislation that will deem Rwanda safe. It's nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever. But once again, this is him grasping at straws, trying to reach out to the racists and bigots within the Conservative Party or in society and say, we're on your side, we're going to fight this. The amount of political capital and effort being invested in this at the expense of real issues like the NHS, cost of living, crumbling schools. Can you imagine if the Tories had invested even 1% of the energy that they're throwing at asylum and immigration? If they invested that in education, in the cost of living crisis, in the NHS, if they did that, wouldn't they? You'd have wonderful schools. You'd have an NHS, once again, the envy of the world. But instead, no, we want to deal with this threat from Reform UK, or we want to double down on this rhetoric and these policies pandering to racists and bigots. It's a dead end. The public don't care about immigration to the extent that the Tories believe they do, or that the Tories want them to. People care about real bread and butter issues. Cost of living, NHS, education, infrastructure, jobs, things like this. They don't care about boats. They don't care about immigration. And the Tories don't seem to understand that, or they don't care. So this Rwanda policy is a dead end. It's been, the courts have rejected it, and the public are rejecting it. Maybe it's their last grasp at holding on to some power, but it's going to fail. Or maybe I'm wrong. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.